from the Nicktoon Animation Studio in Hollywood.
To say that the landscape of television has changed in the past decade would be a dramatic understatement, and I don't think I need to tell you why. The rapid transition from 22 episodes a season that consistently released every year down to some episodes that release every sometimes was done largely in the pursuit of quality over quantity. But that was a pretty recent paradigm shift thanks to the era of on-demand streaming series. TV shows used to be funded by live viewers that watched commercial breaks. If not enough people hung around for the advertisements, that show wasn't going to get another season, and that was that. One of the best ways to guarantee views back then was to have a lot of episodes that could air during reruns, which is why sitcoms and crime procedurals have so many recurring locations. The more stuff you can reuse from episode to episode, the faster and cheaper it is to produce. There's a reason every single episode of the Big Bazinga Thinga looks like every other episode. But live action is a very different beast from animation, which is a famously time-consuming medium. And if you wanted to survive the pre-streaming era, you needed to find a way to make a lot of episodes in a short amount of time, which is a difficult needle to thread for a syndicated cartoon. I was born in the latter half of the 90s, but my core memories didn't really start forming until probably 2001. And if you ask me, right around the millennium was a pretty great time to be a TV-watching kid. CGI had pushed past the novelty of the 80s and 90s and was firmly institutionalized as an everyday facet of entertainment. Shrek was a pop culture phenomenon, a major capstone in the era of gross-out humor.
There's an arrow in your butt!
Pixar was in their prime, with Monsters, Inc. surpassing everybody's expectations, and just about every single commercial break on live TV was filled with uncanny abominations to advertise some kind of breakfast cereal.
Boys, table for two, please!
These stupid honeycomb things gave me nightmares. But it wasn't just the commercials. Traditional cartoons were slowly making the switch from hand-painted animation cells into digital color and composition. You might look at this and think, well, that's obviously not CGI. But in the most literal sense, it is. CGI doesn't just refer to 3D animation, like everything you're looking at here. It stands for computer-generated imagery. Simply put, it's art that was made on a computer. But for the sake of this video, I'll be using the term CGI to specifically refer to the 3D stuff. Side note, computer-generated does not mean AI-generated, which is a whole other thing. Season 1 of SpongeBob SquarePants was the first and last season to be traditionally animated with pencil and paper, traced over with transparent animation celluloids and physically painted by hand. After the animation cells were prepped, they were exposed, one frame at a time, to a film reel, which was the standard practice for animation for the better part of a century. By season 2, the show was still drawn with pencil and paper, but instead of paint and film reels, the drawings were scanned in and digitally colorized with custom animation software, which got rid of a lot of the human-made imperfections. And maybe this is nostalgia talking, but I kind of prefer the messier analog look. Even as a kid who barely knew anything about the animation process, I could always tell when a cartoon had switched over from looking like an old episode to looking like a new episode, even though it was difficult to pinpoint why. But when you remember that you're looking at a photograph of a transparent painting sitting on top of a background painting, those imperfections start to be a lot more obvious, and there's something really charming about the fact that, yeah, these are images that physically existed somewhere. That's cool. Computers and animation are extremely tightly knit, and they have been for decades. Digital ink and paint gracefully accentuated SpongeBob's art style, and being digitally animated allowed them to get experimental with the ways the show blended 2D and 3D with, I'd argue, a bit less success. In fact, this is a bit of a trend in this era of cartoons.
Brian the Cow.
As more and more shows switched to software compositing, they would seemingly randomly introduce elements of 3D animation that might have been considered groundbreaking at the time, but it's almost kind of hilarious how blatantly they stick out today. Some of these attempts range from impressive to downright upsetting.
Return the slab.
But traditional cartoons aside, 3D animation was sort of seen by executives in the entertainment industry as the new hotness, where even if it didn't make any sense at all, some guy in a suit probably assumed that, hey, if we stick this nasty-looking Antonio Banderas in our commercial, people have to buy our nasal spray. But hey, credit where it's due, for 1996, this was pretty decent.
My flower.
Oh,
Stuffed up, it's so good.
oh, that's bad. This is how CGI made TV ugly. And then pretty again. The year is 1974.
No, it isn't.
Shut up. The year...
It's 2025. Are you stupid?
Shut up. By the year 1974, 3D CGI was quickly transitioning from a cool proof of concept to something that was commercially viable, if only barely. What you're looking at here is one of the first computer-animated advertisements ever created. It's unclear if this was ever broadcast on TV or not, but here it is. Oh man, the passage of time did not treat that music well. The Mathematical Applications Group Incorporated, or MAGI, was a now-defunct computer sciences company that wanted to prove to advertisers that CGI was worth investing in. Magi's? I think it's Magi. I'm going to call it Maggie, though. Anyway, Maggie's custom 3D animation software, Synthavision, was the first of its kind, capable of creating mathematical primitives that could be manipulated in 3D space. And boy, primitive sure is the correct word, but this was pretty mind-blowing for 1974.
Computer Visuals presents a new way to create pictures. Synthavision.
A lot of the details have been lost to time, but from what I've been able to find, this Synthavision sampler demo was a mix of pitches that they tried to sell to brands and actual advertisements that would eventually be broadcast on TV. Right off the bat, the limitations were pretty obvious. Lacking any form of polygon modeling, they relied almost entirely on basic shapes like spheres, cubes, and cylinders. Take a look at those cans! Don't do anything irresponsible with this. According to my research, this was the first CGI commercial ever broadcast on TV. I think. There are conflicting reports of an IBM commercial also made in Synthavision airing earlier, but I couldn't find any evidence for that. So as far as I'm concerned, that honor goes to Lifesavers. Back then, the two biggest bottlenecks for computer animation were powerful hardware and easy-to-use software, neither of which really existed. So naturally, CGI almost entirely lived in the domain of engineers, who are usually better at math and computer science than they are at art and animation. Stop typing that comment, I said usually. Through the 70s and 80s, most CGI commercials were intentionally limited to rigid mechanical stuff that mostly just rotated around a bunch. Back then, deforming a 3D model was extremely difficult to do, so they mostly just didn't do it. Aside from the occasional commercial, it was really uncommon to see computer graphics outside of tech demos and labs. Take a look at those balls. This Philips Autoradio commercial from 1980 is insanely cool. I love the way this looks, but they pulled it off by integrating traditional animation to make up for the lack of detail. That stereo was painted with an animation cell on top of the 3D model because computers just weren't powerful enough to render something that complex. It wasn't until 1989 that a little company called Pixar, who you might have heard of, became one of the most prolific creators of 3D animations in the early 90s, creating commercials that actually looked pretty good. Not only did they have a team of computer scientists who helped develop new rendering techniques, but their in-house software was designed with traditional animators in mind, who they'd often hire straight from Disney. The lighting and effects were super primitive by today's standards, but the animation was expressive and full of life. Savers, again. I guess some Lifesavers exec was a 3D animation enthusiast. Part of Pixar's recipe for success was working within the limitations of their hardware. In the early days, they were still using primitive, low-detail shapes, with a particular emphasis on bringing inanimate objects to life. Look at these silly little fruits. They got name tags on them, like people. Fruits don't got name tags, usually. But things started to take a turn for the uncanny when they introduced more humanoid stuff, like this 1990s Volkswagen commercial. I don't speak French, but nothing says buy our new Volkswagen like watching a bunch of cartoon bugs go awooga and then die because they saw this tiny plastic bug woman. Like, I get it, Volkswagen Bug, like the car, but that's not a bug. Awooga. Guess I'm gonna go buy a car now. Things get especially weird looking when they try to blend obvious primitive CGI with actual real humans, like when Nasty Bug Lady came back in 1992 at the size of a full human woman.
Je suis une Volkswagen.
I don't like this one. Pixar had a lot of commercials, and by 1993 or so, they had pretty much mastered the art of bringing inanimate objects to life. The rendering looks extremely dated, but thanks to the animation, most of the stuff still holds up pretty well to this day. You know, aside from the occasional constipated sprinkler.
Por falta de fibra. Olga andar regularmente.
I don't like this one. The high bar of expense and skill that used to be required for 3D animation was quickly getting lower and lower. Pixar had formally gotten out of the advertising business by 1996 following the success of Toy Story, but their commercials were iconic, and everybody wanted a slice of that eye-catching 3D pie. The late 90s to early 2000s were sort of the Wild West of upsetting-looking CGI commercials. When it came to television, the general marketing mindset was to create something that was eye-catching, whether it was pleasant to look at or not. It was very frequently not pleasant to look at, especially when it came to kids' TV, where commercials saw a lot of what I can only describe as cartoon body horror. You'd assume that the adults who made this stuff saw it as groundbreaking and inventive, but they very obviously did not consider the children who would be terrified of this stuff. Hi, I was one of those children. Especially that Pringles one. I still think about that one sometimes. If you didn't grow up in the US, this concept is going to sound a little insane, but one of the most common CGI commercial flavors you'd see was for medications. And I don't know if it was their goal, but pretty much all of them were...
I'm Baker. Don't mind me, I'm just a dermatophyte. You know, a nail infection. All I want is to get in.
No. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but imagine you're in the middle of watching a show you're invested in, then you get jump scared by an advertisement.
This video is sponsored by Incogni. Scry, it's me, Ad Hoc.
Whoa, who are you?
Scry, it's me, I just told you.
You know, I have a door. Do you know what a door is? Ugh.
No, but did you know that your car has been gathering data about your driving habits and selling it to data brokers? Scraw.
Wait, for real?
Yep. Scraw.
Well, that sucks. It's a good thing I got 60% off an annual plan for Incogni's personal information removal service by visiting incogni.com/camwing, link in the description.
Are you doing a ... ad?
Yes, I am. I used to get near daily phone calls from my old buddy Scam Likely, but thanks to Incogni, he finally figured out how to shut up, and as of lately, I get maybe 1 or 2 of these calls a month. Those scammers more than likely bought my info from a data broker. These are companies that scrape a personal profile together with whatever info they can find on you, often for invasive targeted marketing. Yay!
Oh, right. Hello, Cameron. Scraw. As a 28-year-old, have you been experiencing male pattern baldness?
What? No, get out of here! The good news is you can ask these brokerages to remove your info from their database, but there are hundreds of them, and they don't make it an easy process. And once you've convinced them to remove you, there's nothing to stop them from just gathering and selling your info again.
Hey, I'm back. So about your balding problem. Whoa, it seems you're not interested. I'll try again later.
That's why I use Incogni. They'll scan hundreds of databases to see which ones you're in, then send automated requests to get you taken out. And if they have one, Incogni will even try to get you on that broker's suppression list, which is basically a do not call list, but for data collection.
Hey, Cameron, never mind.
Incogni will regularly re-scan and re-remove your info if it's ever regathered. It didn't happen overnight, but since I started using them last August, they've gotten me onto 129 suppression lists and sent nearly 700 removal requests. So hey, if that sounds good to you, visit incogni.com/camwing to get 60% off an annual plan, or click the link in the description.
Did you do sponsorship without me?
CGI and TV shows have a complicated history. Back in the 90s, studios were just kinda doing stuff. This was the intro to a Finnish sitcom about politics and current events from 1990. Imagine seeing this every time you watched an episode of this show. It's art. Mwah. The first fully 3D animated TV series was Reboot from 1994, and if you compare it to the commercials we saw earlier, the level of detail is pretty dang impressive. It definitely looks a bit dated, but knowing where we were only 4 years earlier, this was way ahead of its time. Compared to Toy Story, the first fully 3D animated movie that came out the following year, there's an obvious gap in quality, but given the budget differences and the fact that Season 1 of Reboot was around 5 times longer, that's not really a fair comparison. In fact, comparing film to television was, especially back then, almost never a fair comparison. Reboot was able to animate 5 hours of show in a little less than 2 years because of the way they utilized limited animation, which is a very formative technique in the landscape of TV even to this day. So, it's time for a seemingly unrelated side tangent that will make sense in a few minutes, I swear, just bear with me. Back in the 40s and 50s, animation as an entire medium was pretty much exclusively reserved for little 6 to 7 minute cartoons that aired in theaters before movies. Given their premium status, studios had more resources and animators had more time to work on shorter format shorts, which is why they still look pretty great by today's standards. William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, the producers of the Tom and Jerry series, estimated that one short took around 6 weeks to produce from start to finish and cost around $50,000, which is over $500,000 adjusted for inflation, for 6 minutes of animation. For comparison, the average episode of Leave It to Beaver, one of the most popular TV shows on air at that time, usually took 2 weeks to film, edit, and air from start to finish, with an even smaller budget than a single Tom and Jerry short. And back then, it was normal for a show to have 30 to 40 episodes per season. Boy, imagine that these days. When the quantity expectations were that high, the idea of an animated sitcom seemed pretty much impossible without dramatically lowering the quality standards, but William Joseph and Hanna-Barbera were determined to... Hanna-Barbera is an animation studio formed by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, the Tom and Jerry guys. And if you're at all familiar with the studio's output, then you'll know that, boy, they sure found a way to dramatically lower their quality standards. And thus, The Flintstones was history's first primetime sitcom cartoon in 1961. It definitely didn't look bad. The art style of thick outlines and sharp angles was originally invented so cartoons would be easier to see on tiny black and white screens, and it's a stylistic choice you still see a lot of today. But compared to their previous efforts, like Tom and Jerry, the corners they had to cut to make this show were blatantly obvious. This is all thanks to limited animation. They might not have invented it, but Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile. Hanna-Barbera had an incredibly streamlined process where instead of redrawing the entire character for every single frame, like in Tom and Jerry, the characters only moved when it was necessary, and those motions were intentionally kept as simple as possible. In fact, the characters were sort of designed like puppets, where their head was on an entirely separate layer from their torso or their arms and legs, which could be swapped out and redrawn as needed. There's a reason you'd see a lot of scenes where people just kind of stood there and blinked while somebody else was talking for most of the show. And given their origins as a sitcom, they would add the now infamous laugh track both to simulate their live-action counterparts and to extend the amount of time characters could wait for the laughter to stop.
I'll rap on the noggin if you don't cut out the noise.
There was pretty much no other way they'd be able to create over 30 episodes at 25 minutes apiece in less than 1 year. It might look cheap, but hey, that's because it was. Hanna-Barbera proved that animated TV was not only viable, but that you could make cartoons surprisingly quickly and cheaply. They also proved that you could get away with not paying your animators very well.
Every drawing is inked by a girl.
This newfound efficiency enabled Hanna-Barbera to create 29 syndicated TV shows in the 1960s alone, and that's if you exclude the shows that didn't get syndicated. Still going. Still go. There it is. For comparison, Stephen Hillenburg founded United Plankton Pictures in 1998 to create SpongeBob SquarePants, and in the 10 years following, that studio produced SpongeBob SquarePants. As limited animation TV series were popularized, other shows would take it even further by recycling animation cells wherever they could. One of my favorite examples of this was in the original Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, yet another Hanna-Barbera original from 1969, where there were heavily reused frames in every single episode. Watching this show as a kid, I always loved looking for all the weird production errors, which there were a lot of, so you didn't have to look hard. Body parts blipping in and out of existence, floating heads that don't line up with the torso, or Fred breaking his neck were just part of the charm of the show. They were also working under unbelievably tight deadlines with a limited number of animation cells per episode, which meant that skilled ex-Disney animators weren't given the time they needed to correct horribly off-model drawings or repaint smeared line work. Limited animation wasn't limited to the cheapest crap you could pump out. In a lot of cases, even with high-budget cartoons, it was just the most efficient way for characters to have a conversation.
Oh, Bart, cartoons don't have to be 100% realistic.
This allowed animators to get away with not much more than some lip sync, nodding their heads, and some really simple gestures for a good chunk of the episode. And if they did it well enough, they could usually make it look pretty nice without expending an insane amount of effort, right? It looks nice, right? Limited animation was especially noticeable in anime, to the point where that's kind of what it became known for, at least for the stuff that was localized to the US. Dragon Ball Z was filled with super intense, really well animated fight sequences that were regularly interrupted by a character standing on the sidelines going, "Whoa! Whoa! This is a super intense, really well animated fight sequence! The more complex a scene is, the less budget is going to be left over for all the cool stuff they wanted to do. Like this stuff. If you can't handle me at my "No, Goku, don't ring out!" then you don't deserve me at my... I think it's important to understand the landscape of what was expected back then. These days, the overwhelming quantity of really good stuff you can stream means that audiences are a lot more willing to accept a measly 6 to 10 episodes per season, because there'll always be a million other things to watch when they're done with it. But back then, people just expected more show per show, often regardless of quality. So, what did any of that have to do with CGI? Animation is time-consuming, and broadcast television demands a lot of it. But what if you could animate an entire episode instantly? Introducing the first real-time animated cartoon, thanks to motion capture technology. Donkey Kong Country was the first TV series to primarily use motion capture for its character animation, which was astonishingly ahead of its time for 1996. This allowed them to make animation on the fly by recording the performance of a real human who looked super cool. You might be thinking, why Donkey Kong? That's such a random choice for a TV show. But 2 years earlier, the game of the same name released for the Super Nintendo, which used 3D animation that they converted into pixel art, which looked really impressive for 1994. And yeah, that's gaming. That's right, I found a way to bring video games into this. Donkey Kong, surprisingly, has a long history of boundary-pushing CGI. My biggest problem with the TV show is that I really don't like looking at the TV show, which is arguably an issue for something you're supposed to look at. A lot of talent went into the production, and I can genuinely tell that the people who made it were pretty passionate about their work, but even by 1996 standards, the low-res textures and unnatural, what I will very charitably describe as lip sync, was a bit too much for most audiences, so this show only got 40 episodes. Man, it must have been cheap.
Why did I use up my best material on this shindig?
Another fully CGI series from 1996 was Beast Wars: Transformers. These visuals are a little on the messy side, but the characters had some impressively complicated animation rigs for the time. I know a lot of you watching this will have some strong nostalgia for this show, but I don't. It's ugly. Sorry. By the late 90s, CGI TV got more and more normalized, and it'd be difficult to cover every notable example. But the one thing they all had in common is that they looked pretty bad compared to what we were seeing in theaters. But that's sort of to be expected, given the time and budget. We've been through this. One of the main things holding them back from their theatrical counterparts were the quality of their models. Looking at some of these, it's pretty obvious that they're made up of a bunch of simplified shapes and stuck together, which was the most efficient way to do it, because efficiency was the name of the game with TV. The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius was a pretty major milestone in the world of computer animation because it was one of the first 3D animated shows made with a kids' TV budget that actually looked pretty good. And I'd argue that it looked better than some of the shows that would succeed it years later. That's because they were able to create complex models and animation rigs for every single character, prop, and environment, instead of relying on a bunch of geometric primitives. The way they pulled this off was by repurposing most of the models from the movie Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, which released in theaters in 2001. This enabled near theatrical quality on a television budget, which, funnily enough, brings us into the millennium, the era that networks started producing made-for-TV movies. The Fairly OddParents movie, Abra Catastrophe, was essentially a really long episode with more budget and more spectacle. That extra budget went into things like the opening title sequence, which used 3D animation to pretty faithfully recreate the blocky buildings and dark outlines of the show's normally 2D environments. The climax of the movie was kicked off with a really impressive battle against a giant sphinx, which blew my mind as a kid. The hybridized 3D kind of sticks out like a sore thumb in the otherwise traditionally animated art style, but in 2003 there wasn't much like this. A couple years later, the Fairly OddParents crossed over with Jimmy Neutron for the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour. I always thought it was cool to see the characters swap art styles, which worked pretty seamlessly in this direction, but translating the very flat Fairly OddParents art style into 3D was not as graceful. Timmy's giant mouth pretty much worked just fine with his big buck tooth, but Cosmo and Wanda have teeth, plural, and they ended up kind of looking like Venom. AJ was mostly unscathed, but Chester... I hate this. They should not have done this. At the end of the third special, some cartoon shenanigans happen and the universes of both shows merge into one. Everybody from Jimmy Neutron gets redesigned into the Fairly OddParents style, and they're projected onto extruded backdrops of themselves, so they're all simultaneously flat and 3D. I really want to know how they planned this whole thing out. You might think it would be easy enough to just draw the characters, then import them into 3D animation software, but then they do stuff like this. It's been a challenge to find any behind-the-scenes info on this special, which is a real bummer. If you know of any, please sound off in the comments because I really want to see it. One thing's for sure, I don't need insider info to know that this was a logistical nightmare, and a lot of people crunched hard to make it look as good as it did. So from one animation cruncher to another, kudos whoever you are. I got 3 hours of sleep last night. Hybridizing traditional cartoons with elements of 3D animation became a bit of a staple technique around this time. They didn't do it just because it looked cool, which it did, but being able to add complex geometry to a shot that didn't need to be redrawn frame by frame was a massive boon to the animation process. Adjusted for inflation, the budget per episode of a syndicated cartoon in the 90s hadn't really increased that much compared to their Hanna-Barbera counterparts from 30 years earlier. And yet, your average episode of Futurama from 1999 looks astonishingly better than your average episode of The Jetsons from 1962, despite costing around the same amount. Futurama's intro was almost entirely CGI, stylized to mimic the hand-drawn appearance of the rest of the show, as was the Planet Express ship anytime it was shown on screen. Just by the way it all moves, it's pretty easy to tell which elements are which, but CGI enabled Futurama to do some incredibly ambitious stuff that would have been a nightmare to animate by hand. Blending the mediums together made it easier on the animators, and it looks really good. Thanks to advancements in digital ink and paint, improvements to the limited animation process, and the addition of 3D animation, cartoons were able to boost their quality considerably. Invader Zim did the exact same thing. The intro was about a 50-50 mix of CGI and hand-drawn, and you'd see 3D elements anytime Zim got into his ship or went into space or used any kind of advanced technology, like when his house came to life and tried to order food at a drive-thru. We already talked about SpongeBob, which used it pretty sparingly, but the CGI was at its best when they were punching up a joke, like in the episode Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy! Nickelodeon was really pushing animation boundaries back then, and in 2005, we got Avatar: The Last Airbender. As far as I can tell, every single one of the Fire Nation's war machines, like the balloons, the tanks, the giant drill, were all CGI. You can spot them from a mile away because Avatar's limited animation style was designed to mimic anime, which is traditionally a lot stiffer. These things, coming in at a super fluid frame rate with precise, consistent geometry, tended to clash with the hands-drawn art style in my opinion, but not necessarily in a bad way. They looked like they weren't supposed to be there, which I think is kind of the point. The sequel series, The Legend of Korra, leaned into this stuff way harder, and the technology behind it got a huge upgrade in just a few short years. I'm gonna spoil some stuff from Korra's final episodes, so skip to this timestamp if you don't want to see it. The visual styling is very similar to Last Airbenders, but the setting is a lot more steampunk with kind of a 1930s Art Deco aesthetic. I mean, they're not fooling anybody here. It's still obvious when they use CGI, but instead of trying to mask it, they just leaned right into it. We've got car chases, we've got airplanes, we've got mech fights, but don't forget the giant robot equipped with spirit lasers, made by Earthbender Hitler. We don't really need to talk about the giant robot equipped with spirit lasers made by Earthbender Hitler. At least it looks really cool, though. Speaking of giant robots, in the Season 1 finale of Phineas and Ferb, the one that Doofenshmirtz is piloting swaps between computer-rendered and hand-drawn depending on what he's interacting with. Like in this shot, it's clearly CGI as he's reaching out to grab Candace, but once she's in his hand, it switches to a drawing. But once the action picks up and they start moving again, it's back to CGI. Some of the visuals definitely look a bit dated here, but 2D Candace climbing into the 3D car is actually pretty dang seamless. And while we're still on the subject of cars and giant robots in a beloved traditionally animated Disney Channel original series from the 2010s, nailed it, Gravity Falls is one of the best looking cartoons ever made. There's a level of care and attention to detail here that you pretty much never see in children's media. In the show's very first episode, the animation team gets to flex their skills a bit with this chase sequence against a giant gnome, made of smaller gnomes. Much like the last example, this golf cart switches between animation techniques depending on the type of shot it is. When they focus on character action, it's hand-drawn, and in the wide-angle chasing shots, it's a 3D model. Okay, but check this part out. As they drift under the tree, the cart itself is CGI, so it moves in a very fluid 24 frames per second, but the hand-drawn characters sitting in the golf cart are also animated at 24. They decided to redraw both characters 44 times from different angles rotating 360 degrees for a shot that isn't even 2 seconds long. And then they did it again in literally the next episode. CGI boat, this time with 3 hand-drawn characters, all entirely redrawn frame by frame. This is the exact kind of stuff that you try to avoid with limited animation TV, but they embraced it head on. You can really tell that Gravity Falls is a labor of love, and it becomes especially evident in the Season 1 finale that I'm about to spoil, so you know the drill. Surprise! It's another giant robot. We see it first as a background painting while it's being built. Once it's powered up, they either painstakingly traced over some 3D animation, or they're just freakishly good at 2D. Like, look at the way it moves here. It's got that telltale hand-drawn imperfection to it. Then it briefly switches to CGI. The next time we see it, for this very complicated shot, it's back to being hand-animated. Throughout the rest of the episode, it loves to flip-flop between techniques, and I really can't find a pattern to it. I'd say most kids would never notice if they cut a few more corners and made it easier on themselves, but the director's commentary for this episode kind of says it all.
We never thought about children at any point in the process, so it doesn't surprise me to hear that some of the stuff was too intense.
When I look at a show like Gravity Falls, I'm blown away by what they were able to do with the limitations they were working within. At the end of the day, nobody wants to make something that sucks. When I look at the primitive designs and outdated visuals of a show like Reboot, I see it as super charming. It speaks to the creativity of the people who wanted it to exist and the engineering prowess of the people that made it possible. When I look at all the sloppy animation of Scooby-Doo, I see talented people trying their best to overcome the timelines and budgetary restraints of studio executives. I like seeing the humanness of it, and with high-resolution Blu-ray scans, you can even see things like the shadows cast by animation cells, which is a reminder that this was a physical medium. Even Donkey Kong Country, for as janky-looking as it is, was put together by a team of people who wanted to push the medium of animation forward using advancements in technology. For better or worse. I might not like their creative vision, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for it. When I look at a show like JJ the Jet Plane,
No matter how heavy something is, I never give up.
Okay, somebody should probably go to jail for JJ the Jet Plane.
I know the perfect thing
Okay,
to
do it.
Why did they change Donkey Kong in Mario Kart 9?
You know what? That actually is surprisingly relevant, because this video does talk about Donkey Kong at least a little bit.